Mom skipped my wedding and cut me off when I said no. She then married a younger man and wanted him to be my biological dad's prom date. She crawled back now to apologize. Hello, everyone? I had a nasty battle with my mother a few days ago, after everything had been finalized, on the day of my wedding. Although it was all her fault. I recently spoke to my grandmother and unintentionally caused her even more pain. For that reason, I came to inquire as to whether or not what I did was appropriate. For the past 10 years, my boyfriend, who is 24 years old, and I have been together. In high school, we began dating, and he is the joy of my life. For me, then, this wedding meant a lot. Our goal was to make this an unforgettable celebration, so we've been organizing it for months since we got engaged last year. My mom didn't give a damn about the fact that he and I had both saved a significant amount of money to pay for this. My parents split up years ago. When I was 6 years old, they divorced, and since then they have been co-parenting me. They were never close, and to be honest, I'm not sure how they managed to keep their marriage going for as long as they did. As they had been together for 6 more years before they eventually divorced, having been married for nearly 3 years when I was born. When parents inform their children they are divorcing, most children are quite upset, so when they told me what was happening, I was overjoyed. That meant that they would no longer argue every day, and if they were happy, it meant that I would at last have a chance to be happy too. I used to spend half of the month at my mom's house and the other half at my dad's since they split custody of me as a child, and I was happy with their choice. Unfortunately, though, I had rejoiced a little too soon since I had failed to recognize that they would still struggle to communicate with each other and be in agreement about me even in a co-parenting situation. Every time they were around me, they were always disparaging one another, and I always felt stuck in the between. I tried to be tolerant as a child, but by the time I got to middle school, I'd had enough. My parents felt that even after the divorce, the other was determined to make life bad for them. I just lost it again while I was visiting with my dad. He got into a heated argument with my mother about me, because she wanted to reschedule our return visit because she had an upcoming event, and my dad was not amused. By then, I was beginning to feel like a burden to them both, so I made the decision to try and leave. When I overheard my dad and my mother fighting over the phone when I was just 12 years old, it was inevitable that he would start disparaging my mother in front of me. I returned to my room and, in the wee hours of the morning, grabbed a few items and headed out. I constantly look back on that night because I don't think I ever did something that foolish since I honestly had no strategy at all and assumed I would simply wing it. I went to the bus terminal that evening, but since there was only one eerie man there, I decided to walk back to a park close to my house, promising to return as soon as I woke up the next morning. Fortunately, I slept off in the park and nothing bad occurred. My dad discovered that I was missing by the next morning, called the police, and I was returned home safely. Of course, as soon as my parents found out that I had attempted to flee the house, when I told them that they had made me feel like a burden by their constant fighting because of me, they promised to try to be kinder to each other out of consideration for me, even though they had never expected me to take such drastic measures as a result of their behavior. They confronted me about what I was going through. My mother would occasionally forget and wind up yelling about my dad to me, but after that episode, my dad kept his word. Even when he and my mother would argue, he would keep it to myself so I wouldn't have to feel bad. Since I really love both of my parents and don't believe they were the bad guys, it made things a little tough for me. I believe that the reason they had such a difficult time raising me was because they couldn't get along with one another. Clearly, it's difficult to raise a child when you despise one another, but at least my dad gave it his best shot. Let's just say that I never trusted my mother as much as I trusted my father, which is why I finally began to become closer to him. It's not like I didn't love her, I just felt closer to my dad. I would still spend time with her when I went over to her apartment when it was her turn to have me, and we would have a great time together. In addition, my father maintained a closer relationship with me than my mother did as I grew up and moved away to attend college. I would thus declare that, as of right now, I do prefer my dad than my mom. I have, however, always loved and respected them both equally. However, what occurred recently was simply too entitled for me to handle, which is why I ended up snapping at her. Following their divorce, my parents also dated other individuals, and my dad chose to remarry almost 4 years ago. It made natural for Dad to be married again since, by that point, he had been seeing my stepmother for about 3 years and they were getting serious. Only a few of his relationships had ended in failure. A little differently, my mother would only date for little periods of time and would never commit to anybody after the divorce, even if the other man showed interest. I respect her choice and don't pass judgment on her. However, a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago, she contacted me out of the blue to tell me that she had been dating a guy for a few months, and that they had decided to be married. She wanted me to attend the wedding. She told me she was just sure of this guy, and he appeared to be sure of her too, but it was also abrupt and hurried, and I had no idea what was going on. In addition, although she had enjoyed herself for a long time, she now desired support from someone. Her spouse, James, fictitious name, had only known my mother for around 4 months at the time of their marriage, and although they appeared to be in love, I had serious doubts about their union. To begin with, there were a few clear differences between them. He was about a decade her senior, and they spent very little time together. He was the one who had proposed to her, and during the wedding, my mother had not stopped talking about it. But since it just made things appear even more suspicious, I don't think she realized that it wasn't what she thought it was. I attempted to talk to her about it, but she dismissed me and said she was confident in her choice. Because I didn't want to come out as critical, I didn't think any more about it. And to be honest, he looked to be really into her. I so went to the wedding with a few of her close friends and family members, and I even sent them my best wishes. Even my father was shocked to learn that she had married someone she had only known for a few months when I informed him about everything, but by then it had already been finalized. As my mom and James appeared to be content enough, I became overly preoccupied with organizing my own wedding and lost interest in what was happening with them. They've been married for 6 months, and since she travels with him all the time, I haven't seen her very much. I didn't have any issues even though she didn't show up for my bridal shower. But when we were gathered at the hotel the night before my wedding, she came on my door and said she needed to talk to me about something really important. After I allowed her in, she decided to inform me that she had heard me discussing things like escorting me down the aisle and having supper with my dad. Although I had previously asked her, she had assumed that I would ask James to do it. I didn't want my mom to feel left out, so I was having both of my parents lead me down the aisle since I felt it would better fit our family dynamics. However, I had no idea what she was talking about when she mentioned James. Since I had known James for a few months and I was determined not to choose any random person to accompany me down the aisle on my wedding day, I was really perplexed as to why she would even entertain the thought. I made it very obvious to my mom that James was not my stepfather to me, he was just her spouse. I informed her that I never intended to ask James, and if she had thought I was going to, she had obviously been thinking the wrong thing. I had never even said or hinted that I would ask him, so I was at a loss as to why she developed this sudden belief. It was absurd. And to make matters worse, she was going to be surprised to learn that I was serious and that my biological father, not her husband, would be the one to escort me down the aisle. She began to act out in my room, telling me that she and James would not be coming at all if that was the case, since it seems that she thought I was closer to her. Therefore, James would be the one to accompany her down the aisle. She also thought that my being walked down the aisle by her and her father would send the wrong message and make James feel a little nervous, which is another reason she had anticipated me to ask James rather than my dad. She continued to act out and I told her that if she didn't want to attend the wedding, she and James could go. I then asked her to leave my room so that I could go to sleep, and that put an end to it. I didn't have time for that, especially the night before my wedding, because I needed my sleep. When I woke up the next morning, my mother was nowhere to be found. I told my husband, my bridesmaids, and my immediate family what had transpired the night before. I'm thankful that I didn't have time to worry about her since I knew I would be busy for the rest of the day, and I think it would have destroyed my mood. Eventually, my dad and stepmom walked me down the aisle. A few people gave me strange looks, but no one said anything since it was clear that I just wanted the day to go well and be free of any problems. I didn't mind my stepmother escorting me down the aisle since I like her, and everything went well at the wedding. However, my mom and James arrived at the reception an hour before the festivities were set to conclude, and I could tell by the guilty expression on her face that she was there to apologize. I was so happy about my recent marriage that I didn't mind her returning for the reception, and was more than willing to forgive her because I had been drinking. After she apologized, I told her that I accepted it, and that she was welcome to go join the others, but she chose to stay with us and informed us that she needed a favor from us. She then requested that we reschedule the wedding ceremony so that she could participate in it as well. My spouse and I were taken aback since it seemed like a ridiculous request to make. And since we weren't going to do that, we clearly turned it down right away. But then she began asking for us. Even James appeared to be pretty anxious. He then explained to us that, unless we did this for her as a favor, my granny would cut her off. The lone remaining parent of my mother, my grandma, resides out of state and is unable to travel due to a number of health issues. Despite this, both of my dad's parents attended the wedding. After all, I had told her that I would send her a video of the wedding. However, my mom realized she had made a mistake when her granny decided to video call my mother so she could talk to me while she and James were driving home. She wanted me to reschedule the ceremony so she could attend, and my grandmother wouldn't be able to learn the specifics of what had transpired because she was afraid of what her mother would say about her behavior at my wedding. Since the venue was already paid for, the decorations were still up, and the most of the guests hadn't departed, my mum genuinely believed that it was a workable alternative. I refused to back down, and I informed my mother that it was entirely her responsibility that she had decided to depart the previous evening. I thus had no intention of making up for it by needlessly postponing my wedding. This was a big deal, and my grandma is all about family and familial bonds. The only reason she wasn't at my wedding was because of her health, since she had been gravely ill for a very long time. She began to argue with me and insist that we do things our way, just to avoid her mother cutting her off. She would cut her off without pausing to think if she could discover that my mum had done anything so foolish. She loves me, and I'm the only grandchild she has. Everyone knew that my grandma would be furious if she learnt about what my mother had done, which is why my mom was in such a hurry to make things right before she could. My mother was trying to video call me even though I wasn't in the mood to fight, so I decided to call my maid of honor, take my phone from her, and before my mother could say or do anything, I FaceTimed my grandma to talk to her and tell her the truth, because I was tired of my mom complaining. My grandmother was obviously pleased to see me, and I quickly got to the point after chit-chatting about the wedding and how great it was. And when she insisted that I reschedule my wedding just for her, I informed her exactly what had transpired with my mother and how she was attempting to con me. I performed all of this in front of my mother, who was essentially paralyzed. When I switched the phone around so my grandmother could speak to her, she was at a loss for words and raged at her for a good half hour before telling her that she had truly let her down. And then, as everyone had predicted, she informed my mother that she didn't have to spend the holidays at home that year, and that my grandma wouldn't talk to her until I had forgiven her, at which point she wouldn't even think about repairing the relationship with my mom. My grandmother then hung up after wishing me luck. And during it all, my mother and James had remained motionless, with neither of them able to express anything. I feared they were going to lash out at me when my grandma hung up, but fortunately they said nothing and simply departed after a few minutes without saying anything. That was fortunate for me, since it would have damaged my reception had they chosen to act out. We made the decision not to discuss my mum and James for the remainder of the day, since we didn't want them to spoil our evening. My grandmother finally gave me another call the day following the wedding, once we had returned home, to talk about the events that had transpired since the day of my wedding. She didn't want me to miss the reception or anything, so she had tried to keep things as brief as possible. She informed me that she had supposedly been having a difficult time with my mum for the last few months due to her choice to marry James, but that she could finally talk to me now that I was back. Since they had only been dating for a few months, my grandma had been adamantly opposed to the notion from the start, since she didn't believe it was a good idea for her to get into a marriage of this kind quickly, which was understandable. Nevertheless, my mother ignored her. Then, because my mom took offense at my grandma's comment that it was a foolish choice, they ended up not talking for a few months after her wedding. Few months later, though, my mother personally apologized to my grandmother and paid her a visit to make up. James, on the other hand, had been quite distant from my grandma, who had been pretty kind to him despite having nothing against him. His mother-in-law had made several attempts to get to know him, but he had always pretended to be too good to be talking to her. She didn't like him anyhow, and after that visit, her dislike for him grew much stronger. She also informed my mum about it, and for the previous few months they had been arguing over it. My mother was always playing the same card. Her parents had always believed that my dad was the right man for her, but after they got married, she realized that marrying him had been the worst decision of her life because she couldn't stand him. Now, however, she felt that my grandmother was not giving James a genuine opportunity to become a member of the family because they hadn't spent much time together. My grandmother argued that she had given him a fair shot, that she didn't even have any personal animosity towards him, and that she would have done the same for any other male in his position. She would have agreed that it was premature to get married, but James looked to be the type of guy who took things personally and decided to act rudely towards my grandmother, which exacerbated the situation between them. The recent FaceTime call on the day of my wedding was pretty much the last straw for my grandma, who couldn't believe that my mom had decided to skip my wedding simply because I wouldn't let James walk me down the aisle. Things had already been pretty bad between my mom and my grandma for the previous few months. Neither my mother nor James knew whose idea it was in the first place. It didn't matter, though, because she had decided to miss my wedding and then pretended it hadn't occurred, trying to convince me to read it all so my grandmother wouldn't know. We both came to the conclusion that my mum had been acting strangely and behaved harshly towards us after talking about everything. It was no longer acceptable for her to treat her kid and her own mother like such. My grandma and I determined during the phone call that we would not be communicating with her for the next few months, or until we felt that we could forgive her, or until she really apologized to us both, since things were getting too personal at the moment. On our behalf, my grandma wrote to my mom expressing her desire for her to wait to get in touch with either of us until we were ready to talk to her. I understood this as a logical response given what had transpired. Instead, yesterday night, my mother began accusing me of being the cause of everything and wrote me a number of really hurtful texts. She felt that I was to blame for even her own mother's seeming lack of communication with her, and that I had intentionally made things worse for my mother. She stated I could have just said so several times if I hadn't wanted to recreate the wedding. She refused to give an earful. Anyhow, she feels that I went too far in telling my grandma everything the day of the wedding in an attempt to intentionally cause more trouble, and even now. She feels that there was no need for me to talk to my grandma and give her more reason to be angry with my mother, because it seemed like I was gathering support to turn against her. She also feels that it wasn't fair, because I had no justification for involving my grandma in any of this and teaming up against her. She may have a point, but it seems like she's simply being cranky about everything again. So AITA, what did you do to get my granny and my mother into a fight? I appreciate all of the encouraging comments you have given on my post. I didn't need to amuse my mother, so I made the decision to just block her and stop this. I don't need this in my life anymore. Ever since she started dating James, she has been acting strangely and erratically. My spouse and I won't even be here by the end of next week, so I just want to enjoy our last pleasant and calm moments as newlyweds. We are spending our honeymoon seeing Paris, which, yes, sounds corny, but that is where we are going. And before I leave, I want to clear my thoughts of all negativity. Even when I'm trying to have fun, I don't want to have to worry about what my mother is feeling or going through. And the easiest way to make sure of that is to block her and make sure she can't get in contact with me or say anything, because then I won't have to listen to it. I have spent my whole life trying to make sure that I treat her with the same love and respect that I had my father in order to prevent her from feeling excluded. To be honest, I would feel horrible if that weren't the case, but those feelings have since subsided. I don't believe I have to treat her the same way because my dad has always treated me far better than she has. That would be unjust, in my opinion. I've talked to my dad, my spouse, and my grandmother about all she said. And they're all of the opinion that I'm doing the right thing by blocking her. And the majority of them even think I ought to have done it sooner, essentially on the wedding day itself. But I had postponed since I found it really difficult to give up on the notion of having a positive connection with my mother. However, it is now necessary. I'm going to make sure that I stop letting her treat me this way and get away with it right immediately. Update 2. Hey everyone. My mother appeared to recall that my husband and I were heading out on our honeymoon tomorrow, so I suppose I must have mentioned it to her at some time. I'm not sure how to feel about what occurred, but I'm going to post it here because I feel compelled to update you all. I stated in my previous update that my mother is unable to contact me since I have banned her everywhere. She then made the decision to email me at my work address because I hadn't banned her there and I didn't anticipate her contacting me there. In any case, I had originally intended to simply delete the email, but finally, my curiosity overcame me, and I opened and read it. My spouse and I read it together, and by the time we finished, we were both feeling rather strange. Because my mother had only wanted James to accompany me down the aisle because he had insisted on it. She had only said how much she loved me, and regretted treating me unfairly recently in the email. She didn't even propose their marriage. In fact, she had attempted to put it off for a few months to give them more time to get to know one another, but James had persuaded her to go ahead. Additionally, it was James the evening before the wedding, who intended to replace my dad with himself after tricking my mother into believing that people would interpret it incorrectly if my father ended up leading me down the aisle with her. She had stood up for him the entire time because she loved him, but she also claimed to love me and to truly regret everything she had done because she felt torn between James and her family. As a result, she could now relate to how I had felt as a child growing up, having been raised by a divorced parent. She said she didn't typically mind James being a little domineering when he wanted to be. But now that they had been speaking for a few days, they both saw that his domineering behavior was what had caused her a great deal of problems in the family. He has thus committed to addressing that and not making her feel bad, and she has assured him that she would speak up for herself when necessary and that she won't just be his doormat all the time. She concluded the email by telling us to make the most of our honeymoon and expressing her desire to truly get back in touch with us once we returned from it. However, it's not my main worry, rather, it's that perhaps he's not the proper man for my mother. I am aware that she stated in the email that James had admitted to having control problems and that the two of them had resolved to work on it, but I'm not sure how much of that is accurate. The way she phrased it, it seemed like she was attempting to hide the fact that James wasn't a decent man. However, my spouse and I have to go on our honeymoon tomorrow, so we have to deal with this later. After giving it some thought, we came to the conclusion that it would be best to let her handle this. I've told my dad about it because I know that despite his claims to the contrary, he is a kind man and won't allow anything bad to happen to my mother. For good measure, I've also told one of her close friends about it, and since they've been friends since my mom's early years, I know she won't spread rumors. I can enjoy a worry-free honeymoon knowing that she will be well taken care of even while I'm not around. Update 3. Hello there. This update will thus be somewhat brief. My spouse and I had departed for our honeymoon when I last updated this site, which was around 4 months ago. We had assumed that we would handle my mom and James' situation after we returned. However, when I attempted to email my mother following our trip, I indicated that I would be open to having a conversation with her, but I never received a response. Even her friends told me that she was content enough, so I decided that perhaps there wasn't anything seriously wrong, and I let it go since I became preoccupied with work and other things. 2 weeks ago, my mother called me again and expressed her gratitude for my telling her friend that I was having my concerns about James, especially because she didn't have the courage to do the same. I was correct, James was not the appropriate man for her, and it seemed like he was attempting to keep her apart by ordering her to shut off any communication with others. In the end, he even informed her that he didn't want her to hang out with her childhood friend because, in his opinion, she was troublesome and nosy. Her friend also realized that something wasn't quite right when my mother canceled plans to see her nearly 4 times in a row and brought up the email that I had discussed with her. When her friend finally confronted her 2 weeks ago, my mother broke down and told her everything. She was at her breaking point since James had been mistreating her. In response, her friend made the decision to stand by her, and the two of them filed for divorce. Since then, she has been living with her friend. Consequently, following their marriage, she moved in with James and terminated the lease on her prior flat. In order to give her friend some notion of the situation's reality, my mom told me about him and what she had stated in her email. She didn't believe anybody would have been able to figure out that she was going through anything else, so she came out to me to thank me for watching out for her. In any case, I'm relieved that she's leaving the circumstance, and I hope that we can all work towards improving things. This information even stunned my grandma, but we are all trying to support my mom and sincerely hope that everything turns out okay.